Item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. Can I get a motion on the minutes?
So moved.
I will make a motion to approve the minutes with some minor corrections to the attendance list.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a high school update. And let me just, before I turn it over to Scott, there's some people here tonight because we're probably talking about the high school. And we're looking at options tonight. We're not making decisions tonight. We're not saying that this option is better than that option. In order for us to continue down the path that the MSBA lays out, we need to look at as many options as possible. So please don't take anything we're doing tonight and say, uh-oh, that's it. So I want everybody to be aware that that's where, tonight, we're just looking at options. So I'll turn it over to Scott to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a reminder to reiterate the chairman's comments, right now we're in the preliminary design program phase of the high school project, and the major objectives of this particular phase are to generate an educational program that defines what the school department and the educators want to see in a building, in a new high school, and what their vision of that high school is. One major component, and they're certainly working away on that, and it eventually manifests itself in the form of a document that'll be one major piece of this particular phase. And then the other major piece of this particular phase is the building committee has to identify the sites that they want to continue to study in the next phase of the project. And it's not about designing a building. It's not about, specific detailed design. In fact, sometimes we don't do any design work in this particular phase. However, because of the uniqueness of some of these sites, we are doing some conceptual modeling on the sites so the building committee can understand the impacts of potentially building on those sites. But I want to emphasize that although we're going to show some massing models on some of the sites, it's really to give you an idea of whether the sites will work or not. We won't be designing any actual buildings until we get to the next phase. And again, the objective of this particular phase is just to identify sites that the building committee may want to consider continuing to study in the next phase. I also want to just identify and introduce Tim Bonfatti from Compass Project Management is here and will be joining us in this conversation and presentation. And then Art Eddy from Traverse Landscape is here. Our landscape architect is also here because clearly quite a bit of involvement in the sites. The first thing I want to talk about is the space summary piece of the educational program. And we've talked about this document a number of times, but this is one key component of this particular phase because it ultimately determines the size of a proposed new high school and every single individual space that would go into the high school and the size of that particular space. And you don't have to be able to read this particular slide. We're just showing that it's a 3-page document, and we're going to go through it in a little bit of detail. We presented this to the building committee at the last discussion on the high school, but we only presented it to show what the guidelines were that are provided by MSBA and show some of the components of the existing building, but we didn't talk about the newly proposed building. So tonight we're going to go through a draft version of this for the first time and just talk about some of those categories, talk a little bit about categories and spaces that are reimbursed by the MSBA as part of their grant program, and talk a little bit about some spaces that they, in all high schools, that they declare as so-called ineligible spaces that their grant reimbursement does not cover. So we're just going to talk through that. Certainly, if there are any questions as we move through, let me know. The very first category, which is right here, is core academic. And so we're going to look at some of the spaces that make up core academic. And in this column, you'll see existing conditions. That means we've identified every single space in the existing high school building that fits under what MSBA would consider core academic classroom space. And then we've got a new column, that's the proposed new building. And then we've got an MSBA guideline column. And so in this particular category, we just want to point out that the MSBA guideline for what they would refer to as general classrooms, for a high school that would accommodate 720 pupils, keeping in mind that they identified 720 pupils as the proposed enrollment for the new high school, and that's already been decided and adopted by the MSBA. So, and their guideline is purely a guideline, but they do utilize it to determine their participation in reimbursement. So when it comes to general classrooms, their guideline would suggest that a new high school for 720 pupils requires 23 general classrooms. Their guidelines suggest that those classrooms should be a minimum of 825 square feet and a maximum of 950 square feet. But when they run their guideline template, they run it at 850 square feet per classroom. So the first thing we're noting is the fact that their guideline is below the proposed number for the new high school, and it's even below the existing number for the current high school. The reason for that is they're going to run their guideline at a higher pupil per classroom rate than Watertown would have in the high school, middle school, or elementary school. So this is going to be assuming an average of about 24.5 students per classroom, and this is what's required to make sure that average stays closer to 21 students per classroom. So that's why, as part of proposing the new high school, we've got 3 additional classrooms over the guideline. We also have adjusted currently in the draft to make each classroom 900 square feet. As a reminder, one of the areas that the current high school suffers most is not necessarily in total classroom count, but it's in significantly undersized classrooms. And you can see by the numbers, 685, 740, 769, 767, 509, 644. Those are considered significantly undersized classrooms, and it's one of the primary deficiencies academically in terms of core academic space in the current high school, and we certainly want to resolve that in a newly proposed high school. So for that reason, you can see in the tally here, the core academic guideline is 34,530 square feet for MSBA, and we're currently proposing in this draft around 40,000 square feet for core academic space, and that would be an increase over what's there now because of all of those significantly undersized classrooms. Now, in this same category, they break out science. In science, we're fairly consistent with their guideline in that their guideline would suggest 7 total science classrooms at 1,440 square feet. Our proposed is in fact 7 science classrooms at 1,440 square feet. And you can see again, the current high school suffers significantly from undersized classrooms. So we're right-sizing all those classrooms as part of the proposed new high school. Another reason for the overall increase in this category, and you can see the comparison. Every single one of the science classrooms undersized, a couple of them significantly undersized. Any questions just regarding that core academic? This is one category where even though we're exceeding the so-called MSBA guideline, there is an opportunity for us to convince MSBA to participate in all of the square footage in core academic. They generally are open-minded to listening to the proposed educational program from the school department, taking a look at the educational program document that's completed as part of this process, and there is a possibility that this will become eligible space even though it may exceed their guideline. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of the summary. Any questions?
Questions from the committee? Lodia?
Yes, Scott, given that you're increasing the new space by 900 square feet, so that's 50 feet over each classroom, why do you need additional classrooms? Because you can easily fit an extra body into any one of those classrooms. So I'm a little confused why you're pumping it up 50 square feet per classroom when it's supposed to be 850 according to MSBA guidelines, 24.5 students per class. Here it's 21 to 22. Well, if you total up all those classrooms, I think we can get an extra body in each one of them. So I'm a little confused.
Sure. This is the abbreviated version of their guideline. If you saw the expanded text, what it says is 825 square feet is the minimum they will allow, meaning they would never allow any classroom less than 825 square feet. 950 is the max. So we've selected 900 at this point in time as not an exact midpoint, but a midpoint over 825, but not up to 950. I will say that right now the school department is compiling their educational programming document, and there's a lot of discussion in that document that came out of the educational visioning that talks about the flexible classroom and the need for additional space in order to be able to accommodate multiple delivery styles within the classroom. There's a possibility we may eventually pull this back, but right now we've got it set to make sure we can accommodate and support what's being defined in that educational program. And then the discussion about whether the school department or the town wants to increase the number of pupils per classroom is obviously sort of outside the realm of this building committee, but certainly understand what you're saying.
Thank you.
The next category is special education. In this particular category, the guideline is not that important in that the MSBA just has a very, very generic template for special education because they understand that these programs vary wildly by district. And we've never worked on a project where the special education program was as low as the identified guideline, and it's because MSBA is not attempting to predict what any particular district should have for special education, and so they randomly chose a low number. But this is a category, I would point out, that as long as the educational program clearly defines the function of all of these spaces, the MSBA will allow this particular category to exceed the guideline because they understand that it's an important program and that it varies by district, and this will become eligible space. So I just want to make that clear. The other thing I would point out is, for the most part, in special education, we're simply providing the same spaces that exist currently in the high school and attempting to right-size them if they're too small, or attempting to reduce the size of them if they happen to be too large. For example, currently, self-contained special education autism is taught in an available space, but it's a little larger than necessary. So you can see in the newly proposed program, it's smaller, but in some cases, this will be larger because the room it's currently taught in, that particular group is currently taught or supported in, is too small. So, but the counts are very similar in that we're providing the same spaces that exist in the building now. I highlighted this particular one because it is one exception in that as part of the discussion educational program, an additional self-contained space for special education autism was identified. But you can see everywhere else, we're very consistent with just providing what's in the current program, but right-sizing that space for functionality. Any questions regarding that?
Hold on. Committee first. Helodia,
So looking at those numbers, for special ed, this would be 160% above what is recommended by the MSBA guidelines. So is it the same kind of thing, Scott, that the school system would have to advocate based on our student population to get this right-sized under the MSBA financing? Because that's a pretty big jump from the guidelines to what it is.
This one is a little different in that MSBA would tell you that is absolutely not a recommendation on their part. The 8,000 is absolutely not a recommendation on their part. They try to avoid getting involved in making any recommendations in this particular category. And it is a category where as long as these programs exist now, and there's an explanation for, in the case of the one additional classroom, why it's required, they absolutely would support very easily this space as eligible space.
How does the Watertown population compare to last year's population and the population the year before?
In terms of the high school students, all the students? Yeah, so our population has remained relatively stable. Last year we were at 661. I think the year before we were like 658. This year we're actually up to 680. So we've had a big increase, but it's not yet coming close to the 720. But we're usually around 650 to 670. That answer the question? Thank you. Yep.
All right, Scott.
Next category is art and music. You can see the MSBA guideline, and then you can see the proposed. We've exactly aligned with the total for the guideline in this particular category. And that also happens to provide approximately the same space that exists in the building now. This is an important one for us to meet the guideline because they will not participate in any space in the reimbursement funding, grant funding for any space that exceeds the guideline. And so far in working through the program, although we are allocating the space in a slightly different manner with the individual spaces, what they really care about is the total in the art and music category, and we're consistent with the guideline there. Vocations and technology is a little bit different, so before I move on to that, are there any questions from the committee on art and music? Okay. In vocations and technology, this is another category where it varies wildly by district depending on what your specific offerings are. Some districts may have a number of career pathway programs. Some districts may have a number of Chapter 74 programs, and it can vary significantly. So it's another area where the MSBA just places a relatively low number, generically doesn't identify any specific rooms, and approximates a size. But after review of this program and all of the specific functions of the spaces, the student participation, the way these programs fit within the school department's educational vision, it's our anticipation that this is a category where MSBA will generally approve the proposed space, again, with justification on all the individual spaces. I've highlighted the yellow spaces because they represent new programs that aren't within the building now. And then you can see that for the existing programs, there's a small reduction in some areas. The robotics went to a single classroom, for example. There's a little bit of right sizing of spaces. In some spaces, they needed to be a little larger. In some instances, they needed to be a little smaller. But the three spaces at the bottom represent new programs proposed for the new high school. You can see because we are reducing the size of some existing spaces, it's not a true net add from the existing to the newly proposed, but it is a small increase in the overall square footage as a result of those new programs. Any questions from building committee?
Steve?
Real quick one, what's early childhood observation? I know the education, but what's observation?
So generally in an early childhood classroom in high schools, you'll have a little room off to the side that basically has like a two-way mirror so that students who are learning about early childhood could observe a classroom without being obtrusive. So that's generally what that observation room is meant for.
All right, thank you.
Neil?
I just wanted to be clear, the highlighted categories, the program areas that you're adding are asks by Watertown specifically through DD, right?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you.
And actually, the school committee approved
Excellent.
this request.
Yep.
Art?
Yes.
Paul?
Does that affect any of the design at the Hosmer preschool with this preschool component in the high school?
No, I don't believe so at all.
No, I think that, so we have 5 pre-K classrooms planned for the Hosmer. I think our intention is to try to expand pre-K opportunities for students in general. And my concern, it's not a concern, but I imagine that if we become a little bit more available in terms of either tuition or financial, ways to get more students into our pre-K program, then we would need more space. So,
Okay, great.
Go ahead, Scott.
In health and physical education, you can see that the guideline, the MSBA guideline, is about 20,000 square feet in this category. The reason for that is for a high school of 720, they limit your gym space to 12,000 square feet. In fact, even if you are a larger high school, your gym space would be limited to 12,000 square feet. This is one area that a few years ago, the MSBA really took a hard line on health and PE space, and they specifically decided that 12,000 was going to be the absolute limit for for reimbursement grant participation in any gymnasium space, and that they would allow you to build up to 18,000 square feet, but the delta between that 12,000 and whatever you build for a gymnasium is ineligible square feet. Now, the reason that we're showing the 15,800 is because what you have now at the existing high school is very similar to that, even though the amount that we're showing is lower, the 14,673 is lower. The space at the end of the current gymnasium, the sort of trapezoidal shape where the climbing area is, for those of you who are familiar with the existing high school gymnasium, is considered by MSBA to be a PE alternative space. So we've got part of that sorted into this category right below the gym. But this 15,800 represents a very similar size to the current space and volume that's in the existing high school gym. Some of the areas where the existing high school program is a little large, but the program is still needed, is there is a pretty significant weight room and fitness area in the current high school. We're keeping that, but we're proposing that a smaller area could still accommodate that program. And then it's a wash there. Oh, in the current locker room area, there's a small reduction in space, small reduction in storage space. But you can see that we're still proposing that this particular category will exceed the guideline. In some instances, something like the weight room and fitness area can sometimes be approved depending on how it fits into the educational program. But we're not necessarily optimistic at this point that anything, in order to be conservative, anything over the guideline would be eligible and would be reimbursable. So we anticipate that there'll be a portion of this, potentially the delta between these two, that would be ineligible space, keeping in mind that collectively this space will still be about 5,000 square feet smaller than the current entire health and physical education program space at the high school.
Scott, I noticed under the locker rooms, existing condition is 2 rooms, but you only have under new and the guideline 1 room. Don't we allow to have 2 rooms?
You are, and we'll break that down into a lot of smaller spaces. For now, we were just trying to demonstrate in a really simple fashion for the MSBA that we were exactly meeting their guideline in that particular line item.
Yes, Elliot?
Where does the
Step up to the microphone.
category called recreation center, does that fit into this area? And what are the elements and square footage part of it?
The recreation center.
Oh, the weight room, fitness room?
I'm
It's
not,
listed here,
It's,
oh, you're jumping ahead on me.
you're jumping,
but
you-
I'm just correct, it's part of your athletic facilities or?
Sure.
So I didn't mean to.
No,
Maybe
sure.
I'll come later.
No, I think what you're referring to is a swing space that we're proposing we may need to provide.
you're a little bit
program.
ahead of the game here. So we'll hold on that question. Continue down this path.
But it would be, we'll talk about it, but it would be that category. And the media center, you can see that collectively, even though it's kind of chopped up, the existing media center exceeds the guideline, but we're proposing an appropriately organized media center within their guideline would be sufficient. This is a category where if we did exceed their guideline, they would draw a hard line and make it ineligible space. So we're trying to work within the guideline. In their category of auditorium and drama, their guideline suggests that they will support seating 2/3 of the student population, and that they will provide 10 square feet for each of those students. So hence, 480 is 2/3 of the 720 pupil proposed student population, and then at 10 square feet per occupant, you would have a 4,800 square foot auditorium. Because the existing auditorium is at 796, we're proposing 750 seats or 7,500 square feet for the new auditorium, and that is one area that they will allow you to build. There was a time when they wouldn't allow you to build over the guideline, but they'll allow you to build over the guideline, but they will make that square footage ineligible as part of the grant reimbursement program.
That's a lot of square footage if we're talking $500.
Lodia,
Sorry.
Lodia,
sorry,
please,
Sorry,
we don't just
sorry.
blurt out
sorry.
here.
Apologize.
Scott, continue.
In dining and food service, we're relatively close to their guideline. In our experience, in a relatively small high school environment, and 720 pupils is a relatively small high school environment, their guideline is a little tight on dining space, and you can see that even the current dining space at the high school feels tight, and all we're doing is essentially matching it. So we're proposing in this category 4,000 square feet for the dining area versus their guideline of 3,600. And then the other reason for exceeding their guideline involves the kitchen. The high school kitchen is really the district kitchen, and their guideline is really only for a kitchen to serve enough meals for the 720 pupils. So they will allow us to exceed the guideline, but that would become an eligible space. And in this category, the delta between those two would definitely become ineligible space.
John?
Just a somewhat general questions. If I go back to the auditorium on the stage, so before you said the existing auditorium was, I think you added those two together when you were saying 7,900. That you were adding the auditorium.
I'm sorry, it's 796 occupants. Now,
Oh, I see.
why can they get 796 occupants and this not be almost 8,000 square feet? Because when we do the proposed new, we're calculating at 10 square feet per occupant. It's because with a new auditorium, when we add all the accessibility requirements and all the ramps and all the larger seats, it generally takes about 10 square feet per occupant to accommodate however many occupants you have. So you've got more occupants squeezed in the existing auditorium than we would be able to get into a new auditorium, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then just a general question of how kind of eligible, ineligible. Do they look at the spaces for, and hold us to spaces, square footage for each line?
No.
Or they put it into a larger category? So for example, if the stage is less than 1,600, do you have that square footage that's less than 1,600, could it go somewhere else that might work? Or
In that category, only within that category. They're looking at the total for each category.
category meaning the 7630 for auditorium?
That whole, all those lines.
Meaning
sections.
meaning everything that falls within that auditorium drama,
Yep.
all of these spaces, they're looking at collectively. So if you want to take 100 square feet away from the stage and add it to the auditorium, they would be perfectly fine with that, you know. Or if you wanted to swap space between two line items down here, they're fine with that. But ultimately, they're going to look at the delta between this number and this number as totals, and that's going to become the ineligible square
But they
footage.
can't see what you're.
I can't see that really very well, but it's 7630 is the key number from their perspective.
That is correct.
Right. Okay.
And they're going to look at the delta between the 7630 and the 10330.
Right, okay. Right, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see the pointer.
I can see it just fine.
Thanks.
Medical, we generally just meet the guideline. It's sufficient to include a program for that space. Right now, the existing high school is a little small in that area, but proposing to meet the guideline. In administration and guidance, we really are meeting the guideline with the exception of the high school utilizes 2 assistant principals and an SRO officer. And so we need 1 extra office space that the MSBA doesn't include in their guideline. And you see it right here as the 1 at 150 versus their guideline, which has 0. And then in guidance, to accommodate the number of guidance counselors that currently exist at the high school, we need 1 more office than their guideline. Minor adjustments, but it's likely a category where they'll declare the delta between the 3685 and the 3975 as ineligible space. And then in custodial and maintenance, we've met their guideline, which is significantly less space than the high school has now, but a lot of the space that the high school utilizes for custodial and maintenance now are former other spaces that they've just had to take over because it was all that was available, and some of them are smaller because they're not really adjacent to each other. In some cases, they're pretty inefficient. So typically on high schools, we've been able to utilize the guideline, regardless of the size of the high school. The MSBA guideline has generally been a good template if you can start from scratch and design the space efficiently in that category. So for now, as part of this draft, and we've got some additional detailed programming to do, but as part of this draft, we're holding the guideline in that category. And then MSBA requires everything that doesn't fit within their guideline, any of their guideline categories, to be combined in this other category. And you can see the Watertown Community Education Space, the video production studios for the town cable, large group instructional / presentation space, that's the lecture hall, that really doesn't fit within their guideline, and then the conference room that is referred to as the alumni room that serves a lot of purposes in the high school, quite frankly. we're assuming would continue. And all of those would be ineligible spaces if they do in fact exist in the new high school. We're assuming that the tech services that now exist in the high school will find a new home elsewhere, but we're assuming because there's an integration between the high school's video production program and the town cable studios, we are assuming that that program will continue to exist in the high school and have allocated that space for it. Any questions before I move on to totals? Okay. In the total, we're just pointing out the existing building is a total of 220,000 square feet. With this current program, we're at 218,000 square feet. The MSBA guideline, before they approve any space over and above the guideline, will be 152,640. But as I mentioned when we were going through those individual categories, assuming we make a good argument, there's a possibility of approval of an additional 13,105 in vocations and technology, generally special education, as long as there is a clearly defined educational program for it, is approved. Core academic requires more work to get them to approve it, but for now, we're suggesting if they do approve it, and we can make a good argument under the educational program for those spaces, that this much of the space might ultimately be determined as eligible for grant reimbursement. Make sense?
Any other questions from the committee? Step up as loud as you can, please. It's, the cord's not long enough. Well,
You know, you didn't show space for heating and do they reimburse us for heating and utilities and et cetera?
They do. There's a grossing factor whereby which, for example, if you net all of these individual spaces, you only get to 146,042. And so the MSBA automatically allows us a grossing factor of 1.49, so they allow us to modify that net space by 1.49 to get to the 218, and that would include mechanical space, toilets, storage rooms, wall thicknesses, mechanical chases, all those other things.
How much square footage do you think that is?
Well, it's 50% of that number, so it's 73,000 square feet.
And they reimburse for all of that?
They do.
So this figure, the 152 by the 218,000 floor area, so right now they'd reimburse us 69.9%, 70%, let's just say, roughly.
Yeah, it's not that, no, it's...
But in terms of space, I don't know about dollars.
Sure. It's more complex than that in that right now they would reimburse you for 152,640 square feet in their column.
Say that again?
Total building gross, 152,640.
Right. And you're saying that could go up or down, but I'm just saying it's about 70% at this moment in time.
And you're saying 70% of this
Correct.
Total 218, 139?
So I don't know if that translates to dollars.
It doesn't translate to dollars because
I get it, but I'm just...
The formula gets much more complicated as we move. We've talked a little bit in the past building committee meetings about the other various cost caps and ineligibles, so the formula gets pretty complicated.
So you're saying add another 70,000 feet for utilities and
No, I'm saying if we look at their guideline, let's just stick with that for a moment. Their total space is net to 102,207 square feet.
Okay.
Net. And then they're suggesting that they will pay for another 50,000 square feet in mechanical space, toilets,
Okay.
storage areas, closets, and that's how
That's
you
where
get to the
that comes in.
152,
Okay.
640, correct.
So that 152 includes that, and that 218 includes that.
Yes, sorry. Yep, that's
All
correct.
right. Very good.
Lodia?
Scott, can you give a rough idea of what this is gonna cost per square foot for the building? Just a ballpark or something like this, when we're talking about all these square feet?
Sure. Our anticipation would be that a high school like this would be somewhere between $550 and $650 a square foot. Okay.
Today.
No, that's,
No, that's future.
That's-
Okay.
Yeah, that's future. Good question, though. Yeah, that's future. So we're going to talk about the sites, some of the sites now. And in the context of some of the options we've talked about in the past. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is all for the purpose of by the end of February, or really the midpoint of February, the building committee making a decision on which sites we would carry forward into the next phase. And as you may remember, last time we broke everything into 6 different options where, just as a reminder, we're not going to talk at all tonight about option 2 because it involves renovation in addition to the existing high school. We know we have to study that in the next phase. For tonight, we're not talking about Moxley Field. We talked about some of the challenges associated with that, but that would be a much different and more comprehensive and more impactful master plan that we can have a discussion at some point in time. But talked about it a little bit last time. And we're not going to talk about option 6 as a reminder because that was just under the possibility that there might be some suitable site of open land available. But we are going to talk a little bit about options 1, 3, and 4 tonight and the sites that they might fit on. So as a reminder, option 1 involves a new high school, all new high school on the existing site. And we'll definitely be studying this in the next phase. But we just want to tonight start the conversation around how it might be accomplished just from a phasing, massing, impact standpoint so that we're really just trying to maximize our time from now until essentially the end of September to have conversations about all of this and start the conversation as soon as possible. This is a slide directly from the last building committee presentation on the high school where we talked about some of the advantages and then some of the challenges associated with building a new high school on the existing high school site. But one of the things we want to talk about tonight is if we were going to construct a new high school on the existing high school site, we really have to, and we talked about this a little bit last time, we really have to make some space to be able to construct at least a large and significant portion as part of a first phase of the high school on the existing high school site. And so this is the existing high school site. Last time we talked about the fact that we would really need to remove this 1950s edition and the 1980s edition in order to have a chance to construct a significant enough portion of the new high school in a first phase. And so we've got to start a conversation about how we would address the loss of those spaces. And certainly to do that, the students, because we're assuming that if we were on the existing high school site, that space would be demolished to make way for starting a new high school, the construction of a new high school, and that the existing building would remain occupied by students and staff, and that because of the loss of that program space, it would have to be replicated somewhere else during the 3 years that the construction's going on of the new high school. And so we're conceptualizing how that might take place. One option for that, and the reason we're talking about it is because we want the building committee to understand the impact and be able to start a conversation about it. But one option would be if we did in fact, and it was what was referred to earlier by the gentleman in the audience, if we did in fact build a recreation building on the existing Victory Field site, that would be one area to create swing space. In this case, we're suggesting it would take about 25,000 square feet to be able to accommodate all of the high school athletic, health, fitness, and PE programs during the duration of the project. And so in this particular conceptual option, we're talking about that as what we refer to as an enabling project. We need that project in order to enable the students to continue to utilize this campus with the loss of the health, PE, fitness, athletic facilities on the site in order to construct the first phase of the project. So we're essentially describing this project as an enabling phase at Victory Field, a phase one where this portion of a new high school would be constructed, and then a phase two where after the existing building is demolished, the remaining portion of the high school, meaning the auditorium and the gymnasium, would be constructed on the site, just as a concept for how that kind of project might be completed. We point out that if that was an option to ultimately be considered, in addition to all the other advantages, disadvantages that we talked about last time for a project on the existing high school site, this kind of project would require that recreation center at the Victory Field site. We'd also have to think about the movement of students back and forth during the construction period. As a benefit, we're suggesting that it is a net add to town assets at the end of the project, and that there's no impact in construction on the Phillips site as part of this kind of project. But it still has the challenges associated with phase occupied construction that we identified before. But it's something we anticipate the multiple options for constructing new facilities on the existing high school site will have to be considered in the next phase. So we're just starting a conversation about how some of those might be potentially be completed.
Got 1 second. Laurie had a question.
He answered it, so
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, keep going.
And when you think about that project, again, very conceptually, but we want to make certain that anything we're proposing is at least realistic. And this is not intended to be a building design. We just want you to understand conceptually how this kind of project might be carried out. We would have to construct a significant portion of the proposed new high school as part of a phase one in the area where portions of the existing high school were demolished, meaning the gymnasium, the athletic facilities, fitness area, and the 50s edition. And then as a second phase, the students would have to occupy, and staff would have to occupy that new phase one portion of the building. And as a second phase, that's the reason the 2 is on the auditorium and the gymnasium spaces, which are these spaces and this space respectively. As a second phase, those pieces of the program would have to be constructed. And this is just demonstrating from a massing standpoint what that looks like. We're looking at it from Columbia Street, but that is that first phase of academic building that would have to be constructed, and that second phase of a gymnasium, fitness, athletic facility, and an auditorium that would have to be constructed. Because we want the finished product to be a significant improvement on the site. So you can see more green space being turned over to the site, kind of a plaza opportunity off Columbia Street. Those are all design elements that will be explored in much more detail in the next phase, but we want to make sure that anything we're discussing conceptually now is at least plausible. Any
Neil?
questions?
This main massing, this white massing area, is that a 4-story building or?
I'm sorry, it is a 4-story building.
Okay, and then the phased demolition would happen hopefully when the building isn't occupied in the summertime? Is that what we're trying to do?
That's generally what we would try to do, sync up this as a 2-year project and then a summer demolition of the existing building that likely goes into the fall and then the continued construction of those, but the separation occurring in the summer.
Go ahead, Tom, sorry.
Scott, is there, I mean, maybe it's a little bit too early in the process, but is there any potential discussion about parking on the site?
In this particular kind of project, actually in any project on the high school site, we would look at this in a lot more detail in the next phase, but we've already looked at conceptually, there's a 10-foot change in grade from Columbia Street to the back edge of the property. So in an ideal world, we would take a very hard look at the possibility of doing parking underneath a significant portion of that building that's on the lower terrace of the site in the next phase.
Steve?
Just maybe a order of magnitude of the avoided cost of not having swing space? Can you have a sense of that?
By not having swings.
In other words, not needing to have swing space somewhere to occupy, but by doing it on the site, is there a sense of how much money that saves us?
We're eventually going to identify the. I'll come back, but we're suggesting that enabling project, that rec building, is a $15 to $20 million project.
Mm-hmm.
So that, that's, even though it's a value add to the town, that's the order of magnitude to create that swing space.
Yep.
Have any studies been done analyzing the existing site in terms of water, dewatering the site, and the value of adding parking below versus the overall cost?
We would, meaning in terms of the cost benefit of the parking going underneath that level. Right. We'd certainly want to take a look at that in the next phase. Nothing has been done on that thus far. We know that on the site currently, even on this lowest level, and the parking that we would be placing on the building would not be an excavation down. It would just be taking advantage of the slope, because it would get a little tricky if we tried to excavate down too much for the parking. It would get expensive too, but we are aware that that portion of the gymnasium that's located in this area here, and you can see it, it's essentially this shape, does have a full basement underneath it. So we know that at least in constructing that they were able to go down that far with excavation, but no study has been done thus far. We certainly would want to take a look at that in the preferred schematic.
It's good to know that there's something at that level currently, just due to edge and other things in our town. Thanks.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, I know this is a programming study now, but I wonder, Scott, if you could, in your experience, speak to maybe some of the logistical challenges of this site in the phase construction, and what impact that might have to, students, faculty, staff, as they sort of move around, and what the impact might be for like contractors, builders, lay down space, those sorts of things.
Sure. It's something, I would say that now we certainly can't do that conversation justice, because we would want to take a look at, in the next phase, at the very specific project that we would be proposing here, the exact phasing, the exact amount of existing program space being taken away, the exact amount of separation that we could get from the existing building. I think that we're confident that it's a very doable project, but it's not a simple project. I don't want to imply that it's a simple project. We would have to employ a lot of different strategies regarding noise, adjacencies, laydown areas, staging, dust control, separation, contractor access, contractor staging, parking. Like it would be certainly not a simple project, but a doable project. And we would have to look at that in sufficient detail in the next phase to be able to make a very well-informed decision about whether that's a project that we would want to move forward with. And really, on the existing high school site, what we're trying to do is just start this exact conversation with those kind of questions, because we know that the MSBA is going to require us to study the possibility of a new high school on that site in the next phase. And so to starting to getting everyone thinking about those impacts as soon as possible.
Elliot?
I know it's, again, it's early. Have you thought about, you mentioned massing, and what do you want to fill in through what you're thinking about in terms of massing and height?
I think regardless of the site, it feels like we're likely into a 4-story building because of the limitations of site area, on any of the sites that we'll be looking at. So it's not unusual to have a 4-story high school, but all of our massing right now, as Leo pointed out, is based on a primarily 4-story academic building, clearly with spaces like the auditorium and gymnasium being single height spaces. In a truly urban school, you would sometimes try to integrate those into your multi-story building as well. We're trying not to do that in any of our massing studies.
Come on.
Well, so far we haven't. Our analysis right now is to just determine if in fact it's even plausible to work on some of these sites. In the next phase, when we're taking a look at real design options on all of those sites, we would likely explore everything from trying to go to less floors to trying to go to more floors and do something like this. This becomes a 5 or 6-story building if we did accommodate the gymnasium and the auditorium into the footprint. So that's one of the reasons we haven't gone there yet, but certainly it may get some exploration in the next phase.
Deal? Get another, okay. All right, go ahead, continue on, Scott. So we can.
This is just giving you a sense of what that recreation building would look like on Victory Field. You can see that the size and magnitude of it, and that's what we really want everyone to understand, is size and magnitude of that kind of building. It essentially takes up what is currently the last basketball court on the Victory Field site and goes all the way over to where the current concession and field house building is, and absorbs that entire area. And then you can see it in plan how it fits there. We wouldn't propose to disturb anything else around it, but we're just trying to give you a sense of the magnitude of that size facility that would be required for swing space at that site.
John?
Oh, it's a gymnasium, and what's the piece above it? I can't read that.
Yeah, it's the
Lockers?
locker room area. It's the concession building. It would be a fitness room. For the sake of this conceptual analysis, we're assuming it's about a 25,000 square feet program, and you can see even in the proposed new high school, the program was about 26,000 for all of health and PE. So there's a possibility that this building could get a little bit smaller if we really squeezed it, knowing that the students would only be utilizing it for three years before it got turned over to the town as a recreational space. But for now, we're being kind of conservative and showing it that
It
size.
would be a gym with bleachers, or it's
Yes.
just, it would have bleachers, so it's that large, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
the program would be a gymnasium with bleachers, very similar to the kind of facility that, that would ultimately be in the new high school. For now, again, for the purposes of this analysis.
Paul?
And we are moving the street there? Is that what I'm seeing, Scott? We're gonna straighten out? Street.
And yeah, in order to place it in that location, the street would have to wrap around the building.
Elodia?
So this is now a street going all the way through from Orchard Street to Marion Road, I take it?
I think that's blocked now, and so in the future, it might be determined that that's, you know, a gated connection for emergency only. As an example, I wouldn't get too hung up on that piece of it.
Yes.
So that, none of the funding would cover if we have a separate relocation? Is that what do I understand? Is that, it's, then becomes this other funding project that would have to happen?
This particular building, as a separate standalone building, as a swing space, would not be eligible for any of the grant reimbursement that we're talking about on the high school. That is correct.
And what's the estimate?
We're gonna get to that.
That's on the next page.
So it's also going to be important as we talk through all of these conceptual options to understand scheduling, sequence, because some of them will become impossible just based on scheduling impacts. In this particular one, that's not the case, but the reason this is laid out as both a schedule timeline as well as a cost timeline is the schedule becomes even more important on some of the other side analysis. But here we're just pointing out that the high school design and bidding would be occurring subsequent to the, quite frankly, the town making a decision as to whether they want to move forward with the high school project, which is currently proposed to be a spring town meeting vote in 2021. Hence the green bar as a benchmark timeline. And the high school would needs to go in sequence. In other words, the MSBA is already assuming that that's going to take place. They're assuming there's going to be a design and bidding period of approximately this time frame, and then based on comparing it to all of their other projects, they're going to assume that sometime around 2022, if it follows a typical schedule, it would be going into construction, which seems reasonable based on a Springtown meeting vote. So we're just showing that recreation building at Victory Field would have to be in place at the time of the construction start of the high school. So it does become a critical project that would have to be completed schedule-wise ahead of the high school to make that take place. And it also shows that really, realistically, you would need to be in design mode on that building, on that particular facility, ahead of that Springtown meeting vote. So just something that we need to be thinking about in terms of if this was in fact one of the options that we continue to take a look at, what that impact is. And we break it out by project because the high school in and of itself, just ballpark, because at this point in time, we don't even have a design. We're saying 160 to 180 million as an order of magnitude impact to be able to compare it to other projects on other sites. And then that recreation building, as I mentioned, a $15 to $20 million project, so that it's not just about the high school, it's about creating that swing space in order to allow that project to occur.
So does that mean this rec building would be built specifically for high school use only and not general public use for the location and it being called a swing space?
I mean, that's a decision for the town. I think there's a phase 3 plan to have a newer or larger recreation facility on the Victory Field site. our assumption would be that this would be turned over to the town for public use, and it would become a facility that adds another gymnasium and adds other spaces to public facilities for the town.
Amy, I'm gonna have to ask you to come up to the microphone, because sorry.
So when building this swing space, I'd imagine we'd have to put it in a timely fashion to accommodate all of our sports that are happening at Victory Field at the time.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Will it impact the athletics that are happening at Victory Field, basically?
I mean, it's compared to the size of Victory Field, it's a relatively small structure. Our hope would be that if this kind of project was done there and have relatively minimal impact to the existing fields, we've intentionally, as a concept, kept it out of the area of the two other existing field area, major existing field areas.
According to this schedule, it looks like football would definitely be impacted at some point here.
Sure, because of the locker rooms.
But again, I'm going to make a statement that I've made a couple times. There's going to be significant pain across the board. I've said it once, I'm going to say it and continue to say it, that we have to make sacrifices, but look to the end game. And as I said earlier tonight, these are just concepts. We're not going to get stuck on any one of these or spend a lot of time on any one of these right this minute. We want to get through these three options this evening so that the committee can have an opportunity to think about what's in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to get this information out there, and then future public meetings and forums and building committee meetings start to hear about the advantages and disadvantages. So it's very helpful to hear everybody's thoughts. The reason these items are shown in red as arrows is we are pointing out that during that entire duration, you've got phased occupied construction on the existing high school site. Certainly a challenge. We're pointing out that all of the health, PE, athletics, etc., would be occurring at that recreation building during that time frame, which clearly requires the students to be moving back and forth for those programs, and that there would be no auditorium available for the program time period identified in that schedule. And then certainly the loss of that concession building, and I apologize, this is cut off, but it is loss of concession and the locker room facilities that exist there at Victory Field while that new building is being constructed.
Go on, Scott.
So we're not going.
Question mark.
Yes, Lodia.
Is that a two-story building, Scott?
It because the gym is a two-story volume in essence. It the massing of that is 2 stories. Yes.
Okay, so this is a gym. It will not have locker room space or all these other things that are presently in the other field house.
It would have all those spaces. They would be adjacent to the gym on a first floor level.
Okay, so it's essentially, okay, gym is 2-story and, okay.
Gym is the highest element, yeah.
Thank you.
So another way of thinking about providing that swing space for the athletics, health, PE, fitness program would be if we consider, because we've always said we're going to take a look at various opportunities to utilize the Phillips site in combination with the existing high school site. So one of those options would be if we in fact constructed a very similar facility that we were just describing as being on the Victory Field site, meaning a full gymnasium, bleachers, locker rooms, etc., but it being the permanent long-term plan for the high school use facilities, but do that on the Phillips site. So essentially take the entire health and PE program and construct their facilities on the Phillips site as a very first phase of the project before we demolish those facilities on the existing high school site, and incorporating the Council on Aging program maybe into a combined facility on that site. And so the phase one of this kind of concept would involve demolishing the buildings on the Phillips site. In this particular case, we could keep the Council on Aging building because we could stay outside of the footprint, at least for that very first phase. Construct a new building for the gymnasium, the Council on Aging gym, and the Council on Aging facilities as part of one combined facility. Then demolish the Council on Aging building, construct a significant portion of the new high school, and then probably as a third phase, construct a final piece of the new high school. Then make a pedestrian bridge connection and essentially create a campus. This is not a new idea. We've talked in the past about the possibility of utilizing both the Phillips site and the school site to be able to free up more green space on the existing high school site. It also happens to provide us an outlet for the health and PE program in a facility that would allow us to demolish the existing one. And clearly, in this kind of scenario, no impact to DPW or Victory Field or any of the play fields there. Everything's going on in this location. It still has impacts. And those, some of those are obvious. It would require a new location for the administrative offices, school administration offices. It would require some temporary relocation of the Council on Aging. The beginning of the high school project would be contingent upon that relocation of the administration program from the Phillips building. And then just to test what that feels like in terms of program organization and make sure it practically fits. And again, I emphasize this is not intended to be a building design, but just basically arranging the spaces and determining if a building works there and a connection works there, and whether programmatically we can get all those pieces on the Phillips site and still have enough area for parking and still be able to accommodate the Council on Aging. We've done a test fit. So this is likely something that will warrant more exploration and detailed study in the next phase. And we've always known that, but we just wanted to do a little bit of testing of it in this scenario. Now, you can see, again, in just this massing study, that certainly along Columbia Street, that's going to free up more green space with the use of the Phillips site. Incorporating the Council on Aging program into a new building actually allows us to make a much more efficient use of the Phillips site, but that will warrant more detailed study, but at least conceptually it appears to work.
Hold on, Scott.
Yep.
You have a question? Yes.
Given the relatively short distance across my question is about the pedestrian bridge across Common Street. Given the relatively short distance from sidewalk to sidewalk on Common Street, and the height that would be required for that bridge in order to accommodate truck traffic, is it possible that that bridge could be ADA compliant?
Yeah, it would be compliant, just like, for example, if we designed something like that, there would be a lobby on each end of it, and there would be an elevator on each end of it. That would be the way to make certain that it's ADA and mass access compliant. Yeah.
Yes. Please go to the microphone.
Scott, were you saying there would be an elevator on each side of the bridge?
Inside the building, on each side of the building, on each side of the bridge, there would have to be an elevator because you would have to allow anybody who's on any level there to be able to go up and utilize that bridge.
Okay.
Lindsay,
But in the health and wellness new construction site on the Phillips site, we were just looking at the different little small script labels there, but none of them really seem to, like, what does miscellaneous gym mean? Because it looks, I mean, and I know that this is not necessarily a proportionally sized diagram, but it looks smaller than the previous rectangles that were labeled gym.
Sure. I'm sorry.
Just kind of curious, like, how that.
Sure, there are components of the gym, that's not the full gymnasium, so there are components of that program that were PE alternatives,
Right.
for example,
Yep.
that we're just trying to make sure we can accommodate there.
So where would the gym go then? Because that's not existing.
It's a level above this.
Oh, clever. Okay, so this is just the ground. I get it.
Right.
Thank you.
yes.
One other question about the landscape here, and I wonder if the building committee had put out any desired outdoor program elements. This option has a flex field, for example. The previous option didn't have that, and so I'm wondering if there were desired outdoor components and opportunities there with any of the schemes. If you could speak to those.
Sure. In the educational program, there's already been conversation about indoor-outdoor connections. There's always been a goal to create as much green space on the campus as possible for a variety of different things, outdoor classrooms. So although that ed program hasn't been written yet, a conceptual option like this is going to have some advantages that would meet some of those needs when they're more clearly defined.
Yep.
I have a quick question. I'm trying to wrap my head around the relocation of admin just elsewhere, wherever that would be. And, you know, with the incorporation of the Council on Aging into the gym program, perhaps there's some crossover between high school programming and some of those services that the town provides. Admin would not be incorporated into this potential building, or no?
It could certainly be a consideration. It's a significantly larger program than the COA, so that was easier to assume. But I think at the time that we're evaluating exactly what this project would be, it would need to be considered. You know, what if it also got included in this building?
Okay, and with a 4-story main massing of the high school, that would be a single height bridge, or would that be a double level bridge going across, connecting 2 academic floors across?
It's a good question. That as even the scale of it might call for a double story bridge. We'd want to study it, study the height of the building on each side, study the proportion of the connections. It's a trick, as you well know. It's a tricky design challenge, and it would need to be done well, so we'd have to make certain that we took a look at those things.
Let's move on, Scott.
Lodia.
Alodia?
Scott, what's the other little gray box that's not a parking lot, but it's kind of behind the 2 homes that are there, up a little bit?
Sure, right there.
Right there, what is that for?
It depends on the option that we ultimately choose. We may decide to take some parking into that area. In the option, we also think that this scenario is going to warrant studying leaving the single-story council on aging in that area. So it was more of a placeholder.
Is this similar to kind of the design that you showed at the MSBA program?
No,
Okay,
no,
just
not at
asking.
all. Yeah, not at all.
That rocked my world.
Yeah, Not at all, because this is massing.
Okay. Thank you.
Lisa?
Hi, I wasn't sure, you just mentioned that you were talking about maybe keeping the senior center there, but I also thought I saw some demo. So does this conceptually, if you talked in terms of enlarging programs for the senior center, council on aging programs, how that's taken an effect? And I know you're going to study all these things further, but the other thing would be parking of serving the needs for the school and senior center.
Yeah, if we carry this kind of scenario forward and study it in the next phase, we would want to get a lot more familiar with the Council on Aging program. Right now, they're utilizing about just under 10,000 square feet. So in a 218,000 square foot program, that's not a big impact, but we would want to make certain that any expansion that they wanted to achieve or any program elements that they need, we'd certainly want to get them right as part of doing any kind of new facility or incorporating them into any kind of new facility. But that's one of the reasons we want to have this conversation, is just to give you a heads up that those things all would have to take place if this kind of project were to transpire.
Steve?
One real quick thing. I'm assuming that cost-wise and constructability-wise, it wouldn't make sense to put building square footage over top of Common Street?
It would be very expensive. And there are some challenges associated with it and some history of buildings over streets not being particularly successful. If we could avoid that, we certainly would.
Thank you. Continue on, Scott, so we can get to the last.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump to 3B is really just utilizing a renovation to the Council on Aging building and trying to keep some of it in place. So we'll have a chance to study that in detail later, because what we really want you to see is schedule and cost impacts, because with this, there's really 3 projects going on in some regard. And then we've got the high school project. But in order to allow the main part of the high school project to occur, the gym part of the high school project would have to be what started in that 2022 timeframe. And then there would have to be a lot of decision-making around the movement of the administration program and whether it goes into that new building on site, whether it goes off-site, because all of that has to take place. Either the relocation of it or the new home for it has to take place very early on in the process in order to keep the high school on track and keep all of the other pieces of the program moving forward. We point out that at some point in time, there's going to be a loss of the Phillips and a loss of the Council on Aging for temporary space, so conversations around that will have to take place. Just trying to identify some impacts and then showing that when you do those additional projects, it's interesting in that this project from a cost magnitude standpoint is very similar to the one we talked about with regard to the recreation building on Victory Field, but you're doing something completely different with the money. In this case, you're doing the Council on Aging building and facility into the new proposed gym facility. And then you have to think about the cost impact of either building new for the administration building or renovating a space where a home for that is found. And based on its current program size, is how we arrive at those just sort of order of magnitude dollars for those projects.
Continue on, Scott.
So we want to talk about Victory Field, and when we talk about Victory Field, let me get to an aerial. We often talk about collectively this entire parcel as being Victory Field, and this entire parcel is Victory Field, and this is the DPW. So we don't want to be confusing. If some people think of just one of these fields as Victory Field. When we say Victory Field, we're thinking about the stadium with its practice field, its overlapping baseball field, and then the field with track that goes around it, and all the other program elements that go along with that. And then when we think about the DPW, we think of this kind of hard line that wraps specifically around the DPW site and comes back and becomes that parcel. So one of the things that we wanted to take a quick look at this site is what if we only utilized the DPW site? What if we attempted to propose a high school project that didn't disrupt any of the fields, which are still relatively new on that site, and just built in that area? I'm gonna kind of jump to the chase on this because we don't like this option at all for many reasons. You would really be super compressed in terms of a building footprint. The flexibility with arranging program, if you can imagine a boundary that's literally right up against the fence for the existing stadium, has very little parking, would have no circulation roads around it, which doesn't make sense, would have to bury its gym and auditorium into the side of the hill. There are just a lot of things we don't like about attempting to shoehorn this project into the DPW parcel. It's a smaller parcel to try to place a high school into than the current high school site by far. And then the real impact comes when you realize, and this is going to be true with all the projects at Victory Field, but it's particularly true with this one. If we were going to take and utilize the DPW site, we really should have been planning a site selection process in 2018, 2019 for a DPW relocation, because and Tim and I have talked about this a lot. The relocation of a Department of Public Works building is probably the most challenging public building to locate within a town. And there are numerous examples in the Commonwealth of towns that have spent almost a decade. And I know even Watertown's been talking about it, and thinking about other possible sites for some time. It's just a really challenging process. And so we're suggesting that at a minimum, it's a 24-month process just to have an analysis of potential site selection. So should have been going on a long time ago. And if it wasn't, what's going to happen is the site would not be ready for the high school in the middle of 2022. And the MSBA would not allow you to just defer that project for a year. In those instances, they generally want to remove you from the pipeline and have you re-enter their program, just because there's so many other cities and towns that need the money and have projects waiting. So we really need to keep moving on the timeline. We think it would be a significant impact to be able to, and if there was any intent to try to locate on that site specifically, because of just the scheduling challenges alone are pretty significant. Never mind shoehorning it in from a program standpoint as some of the compromises that would have to be made with regard to the school and access and parking and circulation. So can you tell we're not big fans of that particular approach? Any questions related to that?
The committee?
Because the next step is just to see sort of what happens if you open it up and say, okay, what if all of the site was available and you didn't immediately build in the area of the DPW, but the entire site was available? One of the things we want to point out is, unfortunately, you cannot move the track to the existing high school site because of size constraints. The size of the existing high school site being the constraint. And you cannot move a baseball field to the existing high school site. And so it's very challenging. We really need to keep those two program elements on this site in order to keep from losing them as a town asset. And then we really need to completely reorganize them in order to get all of the field components and the high school onto this site. And this is just demonstrating, to give you a sense of scale. This is that baseball field with overlapping soccer from the high school site, from the Victory Field site, showing you it's superimposed on the existing high school site. And as I mentioned, too large to accommodate. And then this is showing a track, and that's literally the boundary of the track. If there's no fence, no run out area, etc., not being able to fit on the existing high school site. Hence the reason we need to keep those program elements at Victory Field if that is proposed as an option. So one way to avoid impacting the DPW, at least in the early phases of a project, would be to construct the high school on the current track, we'll call it the track portion of the site. And so we evaluate some options for that. We show that if you completely clean the slate on that site, and this is the aerial overlay, just for orientation. So we've got the track with the multi-use field in the area of the DPW, and it's overlapping, just so you know, it's overlapping into this area because the DPW site alone is not wide enough, so it's overlapping into this area. And then the baseball with overlapping soccer, and we've left an area for the high school. And this is going to look very attractive, just because it allows you the ultimate freedom to reorganize everything until you see the cost and schedule impacts associated with it. So we know, and we're not even going to talk too much about the organization of the building, because you could design a lot of different buildings in this area in a lot of different configurations, because you've got the ultimate freedom of having plenty of area. But I want to, and this just happens to show a different arrangement for it, but the same concept. You're essentially cleaning the slate and assuming nothing's there, and you could start from scratch with those program elements. The challenge is, again, you've got to find a new home for the Department of Public Works. Now, in this scenario, you might have a bit more time, since you wouldn't immediately have to demolish the Department of Public Works. But it doesn't change the fact that you've got a site selection process that should probably already be underway. A significant cost to relocate, even if you could find a site, a significant cost to the facility itself. We're estimating, based on its current size, it would be a $25 to $30 million project to replicate that building, which received renovation and expansion about 12 years ago, I think. And then the land is probably, based on recent land values in Watertown, more than what we're showing, but we're just saying for the purpose of the discussion, $15 to $25 million. And you can see the price of the overall project is climbing, and the impacts are getting significantly greater in terms of loss of track and fields, loss of stadium for an extended period of time. If anything happened, and you didn't find a site for the DPW or it was delayed, you risk losing your reimbursement funding on the high school because you risk being pulled out of the pipeline. The MSBA certainly would not entertain the idea of speculating on where it might go. You would have to have a definitive location and plan for its relocation in order to stay in their pipeline and move along. So the schedule and cost impacts are certainly significant in that scenario.
Question.
Lindsay?
I'm kind of making the assumption that this sort of total project cost doesn't actually even touch on what the town would choose to do with the then old high school site, which would be a defunct building with not demoed and not redeveloped and everything, right? That'd be a whole nother set of costs for the town. Sorry, a whole nother set of costs for the town.
It would. We mention it in some of the scenarios, but it would apply to all of them. Ultimately, if you don't build on the existing high school site, the town would have to contend with what they're doing with that facility.
Edie?
So, just curious, on the existing site, you could fit a soccer field. Pretty much is what you could fit there. If you were to fit the soccer field at the existing high school site and not have the two fields in this scenario, the 4B scenario, could you keep the DPW and just have one large stadium with a track?
The baseball field is the challenge. If you want to keep the baseball field, we need the baseball field and the track to be at the Victory Field site.
Okay.
Because the baseball field will not go at the existing high school site.
Right, but is there, I mean, I'm just thinking, is there another location where you could have a nice baseball field in town that isn't on the same site? And still have the DPW and have
Sure.
a soccer field at the existing high school and...
The baseball field is the most difficult probably of the three to relocate because just think it won't fit on the existing high school site, and that's a fairly large site. So, I mean, we're not aware of any site that could easily be relocated to. But if the idea of relocating that was a possibility, then we would want to explore. We'd want to explore that. Certainly explore that option.
And from a sporting point of view, like it's the track and a baseball field that you can't actually overlap.
Right,
Like,
I know. I think you'd have to, if you could preserve the DPW where it is and have a football stadium, I mean, I'm just trying to think of a way to mitigate the cost of taking down the DPW and all those associated issues and still retain the ability to build a new building without phasing and without, in just a blank slate. So I just would like to think about this space a little bit more. And look at some other options maybe for the fields, but.
I think it would certainly be worth exploring taking that out of the equation. It's literally just before we left the office today, Art and I were having that exact same conversation because we were trying to leave the DPW and it's in that place a high school there and still not have a net loss of fields. And what it comes down to is you'd lose the baseball field. So if you did have an alternative location for it, that changes that analysis.
Any other questions?
You would either lose the baseball field or lose the track.
Right.
One or the other.
Right.
Step up, please.
As someone who has a small amount of hearing loss, I'd like to ask everybody on the panel to use your microphone.
Yes.
Anne Marie Clinton with Street. So I'm just curious, so with the 210 to 250, where is the recovery cost for the current high school location, especially with the cost of, land in Watertown? If we did this, I mean, isn't that a gain that would should ultimately reduce this overall cost?
I mean, that's a decision certainly for the town, whether they would want to sell that asset. I I think you'd have to consider the abatement cost associated with that in that factor, but ultimately, the high cost of land in the town, there is a value to that. We don't have, we wouldn't know if the town's in a position to want to keep that and fight for it as a really important asset and resource, and what the pushback would be on suggesting that it would be sold.
So out of the three options, though, this is the only one that would free up a lot and leave it so that that was an empty space that could be used for an alternative and have a value associated with it.
Yeah, if we, of all the option 4, which involve construction on either DPW or Victory Field, it's at that area, they all would leave that as a decision point for the town, that high school asset, existing high school asset, to determine what should be done with that.
And just one final, so this, just from the visual that you have here, also preserves the most open space for the town as it exists now with the Victory Field setting, and potentially frees up other space over in where the high school is, depending on what happens with that property.
Only if the scenario that the superintendent is referring to, where you accept a net loss of a baseball field or a track, because with all the other scenarios, this requires the relocation of the Department of Public Works, which we're essentially suggesting it could be a deal breaker for the entire high school project based on scheduling and sequence and timing.
And so just out of curiosity for that, and where the Phillips School is and the senior center, so the administration building couldn't be incorporated in this with the design that you just redid, moving the fields and setting the high school on that property?
I'm sorry, just say that one more time.
So with the design here at Victory Field and what's going on with the administration, that the Phillips location, which is an aged building anyway, and the senior center, has there been a scenario where you say, we're going to incorporate the administrative building into the Victory Field High School modification, where you said you're going to change the track and the baseball field? And then the only thing that would have to be relocated, it would open space there for potentially both the Phillips location, and if you'd have to still relocate the senior building, but then you'd have the high school and the Phillips location as open property to use. Has that been a consideration?
Sure. You could certainly, it has not, but you could certainly consider that, and we could take a look at it. It still would require you to move the DPW building unless you accept a net loss of one of the field areas. But we could certainly take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Tim?
I just have some relevant experience around the DPW issue, and Scott touched on that.
This is Tim Bumfati, the project manager from Compass, who's a team member.
So we're involved in three we've been involved in 3 DPWs, including currently one in Medway, Medfield, and in Norwood. And the process, and Scott made this point, and he and I have talked about it. The process to get a site selected for a DPW is very difficult in a town. It's probably the one building in a town that really brings out people who just don't want to have them in their backyard because it has a lot of impact on the neighborhood. In the case of Norwood, they went through, and Norwood, similar to Watertown, doesn't have a lot of options around available land. They went through, I think, 5 years of a study. It was before we were involved. And they ended up basically coming back to the existing site. So they looked at 9 different sites that had all different kinds of implications. And they ended up coming back to the existing site in Norwood for the DPW. In Medway and Medfield, which actually has some land that they could have put these on, they went through, in the case of in Medfield, they went through 3 years of trying to find a site. And when they went to town meeting with an alternate site, people came out and essentially the neighbors and got enough energy around it to cancel that project. It didn't pass, and they went back to the existing site. So that span probably took 5 years. In Medway, which also has land, they did the same thing. They basically just decided that they would go back to their existing site. They didn't even want to entertain that sort of battle. And I think to just sort of reemphasize what Scott said, the MSBA is going to want to know that there's a certainty to the project. So if there's that level of uncertainty for a period of time, this certainly would suspend reimbursement. And at some point, they would look at whether, they would continue the invitation of the grant. So I would just caution DPW relocations, having sort of been through them, are very difficult processes to go through.
Thank you. John?
Kind of a two-part question, I guess. I assume that when we're talking about MSBA reimbursement, they do not reimburse for athletic fields of any sort. Is that correct?
That is, they'll reimburse for some green space, but they won't pay for like the stadium, the bleachers, synthetic turf, the track. So if those are in the context of athletic fields, that is correct.
But so if we did a scenario here where the later scenarios where you put the building kind of where the current, if I understand that the building goes where the current oval is, and so the DPW, in this scenario, the DPW is the multi-use field and track, correct?
Correct.
Right. So if that's our ultimate goal, and yet we haven't resolved the DPW part, but the rest of it we're going to do, either whatever, is that a negative with the MSBA, or do they say, well, we're focused on the building. If you don't get that athletic field, that's not our problem, but you're going to do the building.
Yeah, in that scenario, strategically, you'd probably want to make it a separate project that you don't even discuss with them. A separate town project.
Second phase, or
a separate town project where it's bid separately and everything, and then you wouldn't have to get into a conversation with MSBA about it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Again, these are very high level. There's last question. Anne Marie, you can have the last question, and then we're going to go on to the next.
Out of curiosity, will they pay for the administrative building move, or because
No, they will not.
nothing part of that? Okay, thank you.
Very high level, very beginning of the discussion of some options Scott's been working on with Tim, and we will be having several more of these discussions before we make a decision. So the next item is the community forum. Tim?
We have been involved in planning with the administration on the community forum, which is January 21st at the high school. It's currently planned to be at the lecture hall, but if the attendance is great, and we hope it is, and more than the first forum, then we would be looking at probably moving it to the auditorium. But we'll know that when we get there. It's going to be focused on two kind of critical components that will have a chance for the audience to participate and to give some feedback. One is the educational plan in much greater detail than or more around education that Superintendent Goldstone is going to talk about, as opposed to the spaces necessarily. And then secondly, we are going to review these options and try to get feedback from the community about what they see as their impressions of these options. And that hopefully will give the committee another data point on how they can learn to begin to winnow these down. As Scott mentioned, our goal is to get into February, mid-February or so, with a short list of options that we carry through to the next phase.
Dee Dee, did you want to add anything to that?
I just invite as many people as possible who would like to find out more about, I think the point about the educational program, we keep alluding to what it is that we want to do within our high school. I think that's going to be a great opportunity to hear about the actual teaching and learning that we're proposing for the building, which I think helps to frame like the space summary and what it is that we'd like to see in our building. So I just encourage people to get a chance to listen and ask questions around what we're going to do in the building. So.
Okay.
What's the time?
6:30?
6:30.
6:30.
On the 21st. Lisa?
Are you going to have a similar form in other places? There's no a lot of elementary parents that will end up being at the high school.
Well, this is pretty much right now focused on the high school. we may move it at some point, but we want to try to focus on the fact that that's strictly the high school. We will see what happens as we move forward if we want to go elsewhere. But right now, yes. Yes. Well,
Where you going?
Scott or Tim, did you have anything else to add on the high school? No. Okay, sustainability committee update. I don't think we have a whole lot. There hasn't been any meetings.
No, there hasn't been a meeting, so I don't have any update from the committee. I don't know whether you or if, one of the actions we took was to kind of initiate a process to hire a consultant. I don't know if anyone can speak to that, because I'm not aware of that process.
Given the fact that we had extended holidays and extended vacations, it's kind of fallen a little bit behind, and we will probably address that by the end of the week.
Okay.
We're attempting to address it by the end of the week. Review and approval of invoices.
Don't have any tonight, we'll have them in a week.
Okay. Schedule of next meetings. We are meeting January 15th upstairs, back to the town council chamber. And we'll be doing some elementary school discussion. And again, the January 21st, the following week on a Tuesday, is the community forum. And then this building committee will again be meeting on January 29th to continue some elementary school and high school discussions. Anything else? Yes.
I just have a question. My name is Richard Coleman. I'm a Standish Road resident. I really appreciate all your hard work on this. I have a question about the elementary schools. I didn't get the agenda. I came in late. I don't know when, is this, can I ask?
There was nothing on the agenda tonight about the elementary schools.
So don't ask a
That's
question.
you can ask the question, sure.
Okay, so, sustainability, yes, relative to sustainability. I met someone from Belmont who was talking to me about geothermal. And my understanding is that Cambridge is using geothermal. I know the initial recommendation so far has been to not use geothermal, or the sense is that it's not feasible. I just wondered whether that's something that's worth looking into, given my understanding regarding getting enough solar panels to produce the energy for the schools. And I wondered if it's worth looking into the feasibility of geothermal more than we have.
Scott, if you can help us with that?
Sure. We did look at that about a year ago. There was a time period when geothermal was utilized because it was the only option if you wanted to have a heat pump, and almost everybody that was trying to do super efficiency were doing heat pumps. Both the elementary schools everything in those is heat pump driven, but it's air source heat pumps versus water source, which is geothermal. And the relative efficiencies between those two systems now, and particularly in the last 5 years with the increase in efficiency in air source heat pumps, just showed that we were going to be able to get to the ultimate efficiency with much less cost going air source heat pump versus geothermal. Because right now, the energy modeling for the two elementary schools shows that we're at about a 23.5 EUI energy use index. If we achieve that, they'll be more efficient than any of those geothermal buildings you're talking about by far. And so we think we've done it with the air source heat pump formula versus the geothermal. And we did talk a lot about a year ago when we were designing the systems about the advantages and disadvantages of those two systems. But we are, both of the elementary school, the Cuniff and the Hosmer, both the new elementary schools are 100% air source heat pump, no carbon emissions, et cetera.
Okay, and I'm certainly no expert on it, but I just wonder whether it makes sense to, I don't know, hire an independent analysis or something like that to ensure that, that we're not missing out on an opportunity to generate energy, efficiently on the site. I don't know.
Yeah, the analysis was presented. I mean, in order to do a true geothermal analysis, you have to, you have to do a lot of testing on the site, but just the cost analysis on the increased cost for geothermal versus the savings and energy efficiency was the savings was so small that it was incremental because we were already using air source heat pump technology.
Okay, yeah, I mean, just the fact that so many local schools are using it made me wonder whether maybe we should look into it more. But thank you.
Yes, Charlie, go up to the microphone, please.
Jocelyn Tager, I'm a Watertown resident. I want to follow up on what Richard was saying. My understanding is that we're having trouble getting those two elementary, or at least the kind of to zero net energy using air source pumps.
That's false.
We are
That's not
able
true.
to get enough solar on, we're able to get enough solar on those buildings to make them ZNE.
No, but the problem is not the air source heat pumps. Like,
No, I understand that. I do understand that. But it also seems to me that if, so this is my question. If those buildings, or at least the kind of had ground source pumps, then what would be required of the air source pumps could be covered by the solar that's available. Do you understand?
absolutely false.
That is false.
That's absolutely false.
How so?
Okay, this was a high school discussion. We're not talking about the elementary schools. I allowed one question. We're not going to get into who's right and who's wrong at this point. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second? All those in favor? Opposed? The ayes have it.